Notice what happens the next time someone pays you a compliment you don't believe you deserve. Watch how quickly you deflect it, joke about it, or quietly explain it away. That reflex, so fast you barely register it as a decision, is not modesty. It is a guard posted at a door you built a long time ago, and the thing it's guarding isn't what you think. Most people assume they know themselves reasonably well. They know their preferences, their history, the shape of their own personality well enough to describe it accurately to a stranger. What they don't know, and what Carl Jung spent much of his life trying to explain, is that the self they're describing is only ever the edited version, the parts that were allowed to stay in view. Everything else, the anger that wasn't safe to express, the ambition that seemed too arrogant to admit, the neediness that got mocked out of you early, didn't disappear when you stopped showing it. It went somewhere. And that somewhere has been quietly steering your life ever since, from a position you were never trained to notice. Jung called this disowned material the shadow, and the name is more literal than it sounds. A shadow is not absent. It is simply the part of the shape you cannot see, because the light is coming from the wrong angle, cast by you, attached to you, moving exactly when you move, whether you're looking at it or not. What makes the shadow dangerous is not that it's dark or evil in some dramatic sense. Most of what lives in the shadow was originally perfectly reasonable. Ordinary anger, ordinary desire, ordinary fear. What makes it dangerous is that it is unsupervised. A feeling you have consciously acknowledged can be examined, questioned, worked with. A feeling you have banished from consciousness can only leak, disguised as something else, indirect, distorted, and usually aimed at the wrong target entirely. This is where most conversations about self-improvement go wrong. They assume the problem is a lack of information, that if you simply understood your patterns better, listed your triggers, read the right framework, the patterns would loosen their grip. But patterns built from disowned material don't respond to information the way conscious problems do, because the entire reason they're still running the show is that you can't see them clearly enough to argue with them. You can only feel their effects. The sudden irritability with no clear cause, the attraction to people who mistreat you in ways that feel oddly familiar, the sabotage of good things right when they start going well. Each of these, examined honestly, usually traces back to something you decided long ago wasn't allowed to exist in the open. Consider how this actually gets built, because the mechanism matters more than the metaphor. A child expresses something, anger at a sibling, sadness that embarrasses a parent, a desire that gets laughed at, and the response teaches a lesson far more durable than the incident itself. Not this specific feeling was wrong, but this entire category of feeling is unsafe to have visibly. The child adapts, because children are extraordinarily good at adapting to whatever keeps them loved and safe. They learn to perform the acceptable version of themselves and quietly relocate everything else, somewhere the adults in the room can't see it. This isn't dishonesty. It's the most intelligent available response to an environment with real consequences for the wrong feeling appearing at the wrong time. The problem is that the relocation doesn't come with an expiration date. The child grows up, the original threat disappears, the parent who couldn't tolerate the anger is no longer even in the room, and the exile continues anyway, running on the same rules it was built under decades earlier, because nobody ever went back to update them. This is why a fully capable, intelligent adult can still find themselves unable to express a simple need without apologizing for it 3 times first, or unable to feel anger without immediately feeling guilty for feeling it, long after any actual danger from expressing it has vanished. It is worth pausing on exactly how specific this rule writing tends to be, because the shadow is rarely built from one dramatic event. It is built from repetition, dozens of small moments that individually seem unremarkable. A raised eyebrow here, a joke made at your expense there, a subject quietly changed whenever you brought up something too vulnerable. No single instance would explain the depth of the pattern that eventually forms. It is the accumulation, the way water shapes stone not through any single strike but through years of the same small pressure applied in the same place. that eventually carves a channel deep enough to determine which direction everything else flows. Jung believed that whatever gets exiled from consciousness doesn't simply sit quietly in storage. It seeks expression the way any living material does, and if it can't come out directly, it finds an indirect route instead. This is where projection enters the picture, and it is one of the shadow's most reliable exits. The quality you cannot tolerate in yourself becomes, with uncanny consistency, the quality you find most infuriating in other people. The person who cannot access their own anger becomes hypersensitive to anger in everyone around them, reading hostility into neutral tones, feeling attacked by ordinary disagreement. The person who has disowned their own ambition becomes quietly contemptuous of ambitious people, dismissing their drive as arrogance, when what's actually happening is a much older, unexamined grief about a version of themselves they never let exist. This is uncomfortable to sit with, because it suggests that a great deal of what you experience as judgment of other people is actually a report on what you've refused to examine in yourself. Not always, and not entirely, some judgment is simply accurate assessment of someone else's behavior. But the judgments that carry unusual heat, the ones that arrive with more intensity than the situation seems to warrant, are worth a second look, because that extra charge is very often the shadow signaling its presence, using someone else's behavior as a screen onto which it can finally, safely express itself. There's a useful test for telling ordinary disagreement apart from a projection at work, and it has to do with proportion rather than content. Ordinary irritation tends to match its trigger. Someone cuts you off in traffic, you feel a flash of annoyance. It passes within a minute or two, and you don't think about it again. A projection doesn't behave this way. It lingers. It replays. It recruits evidence. Suddenly you notice this same quality in 3 other people you know, all in the same week, and it starts to feel less like an observation and more like a mission. That disproportion, the gap between how much a situation actually warrants and how much charge you're carrying about it, is usually the most reliable signal available that something older than the present moment has entered the room. There's a second exit the shadow uses just as often, and it's considerably harder to notice because it doesn't look like judgment at all. It looks like self-sabotage. A person who has never allowed themselves to consciously want success because wanting it once seemed dangerous or arrogant will often find a way to undermine it right at the point it becomes real, missing an opportunity through carelessness that seems unlike them, picking a fight right before an important milestone, disappearing right when consistency would have paid off. This rarely looks like sabotage from the inside. It looks like bad luck, or a sudden loss of motivation, or simply being tired at the worst possible time. But examined closely, a pattern usually emerges. The undermining always seems to arrive at the exact threshold where the exiled desire would have to become fully conscious and fully claimed, and claiming it was never permitted. There's a third, quieter exit worth naming, because it rarely gets discussed alongside projection and sabotage, and it involves the body rather than behavior at all. Unintegrated emotional material has a well-documented tendency to surface as physical symptom when it has been denied every other avenue of expression. A chronic tension in a specific muscle group, a stomach that reacts to stress in ways medical explanation alone doesn't fully account for. Fatigue that persists despite adequate rest. This is not to say every physical symptom is psychological in origin. That would be an oversimplification worth resisting. But when a physical pattern shows no clear medical explanation and correlates suspiciously well with specific emotional territory, certain relationships, certain kinds of pressure, certain unspoken resentments, the body is very often doing what the conscious mind has refused to do, carrying the weight of something that was never given a legitimate place to be expressed in words instead. Jung's broader project, the process he called individuation, was essentially the long, deliberate work of ending this exile, not by indulging every disowned impulse the moment it's noticed, but by bringing it back into conscious relationship, examining it honestly, understanding what it was actually protecting or expressing in the first place, and then deciding, as an adult with actual choices, what to do with it. This is a fundamentally different activity than simply venting suppressed feelings, which usually just recreates the same unsupervised chaos in a different direction. It is closer to a negotiation, sitting down with a part of yourself you've spent years avoiding and finally asking what it actually wants, rather than continuing to assume you already know and continuing to refuse it accordingly. This work is slower and less satisfying than most self-help narratives promise, because the shadow rarely announces itself directly. It shows up sideways, in a disproportionate reaction to something small, in a recurring dream that keeps returning to the same unresolved image, in the specific kind of person you keep finding yourself drawn to and then resenting. Jung paid close attention to these sideways signals precisely because the shadow, denied direct access to consciousness, has to speak in code, and learning to read that code is most of what this kind of self-knowledge actually consists of. Dreams deserve particular attention here, because Jung considered them one of the most direct lines of communication the unconscious has available, precisely because the conscious, editing mind is largely offline while they occur. A recurring dream in particular, the same threat, the same unfinished task, the same figure who keeps appearing in slightly different settings, is rarely random. It tends to indicate unfinished psychological business circling back, insistently, until it receives the conscious attention it hasn't yet been given while you're awake. This doesn't require becoming a dream analyst overnight. It simply requires taking the recurrence seriously enough to ask what emotional territory the dream keeps returning to, rather than dismissing it as noise the way most people are trained to. There's a particular twist worth naming here, because it explains something that otherwise seems paradoxical. The shadow is not always the parts of you that are worse than your conscious self-image. Sometimes it holds the parts that are better. The confidence you were taught was arrogance. The tenderness you were taught was weakness. The creative instinct you were told was impractical, and therefore learned to silence. Jung called this the golden shadow, disowned material that is actually superior to the persona built to replace it. And it explains why some people feel an inexplicable, almost painful admiration for certain strangers, artists, public figures, even people they've never met, admiration that carries an edge of something close to grief. That grief is usually recognition, a glimpse of a capacity in someone else that you once had access to yourself, before it became too costly to keep. This reframes what envy and hero worship often actually are. They are rarely simply about the other person's circumstances. They are, more often, a signal pointing directly at your own exiled material, using someone else's visible expression of it as the only mirror currently available. This doesn't mean every admiration is secretly about yourself. Some appreciation is simply appreciation. But the admiration that arrives with an ache attached, the kind that makes you a little sad to witness, deserves the same closer look as the judgments that arrive with unusual heat. Both are usually pointing at the same door. It's worth noting how this golden shadow tends to operate differently across a life. In adolescence, it often attaches to public figures at a distance, musicians, athletes, characters in fiction, because the distance itself feels safe, admiration without the vulnerability of actually claiming the quality for yourself. In adulthood, it tends to migrate closer, attaching to people you actually know, a colleague whose confidence unsettles you slightly more than it should, a friend whose ease with vulnerability makes you strangely uncomfortable to be around for reasons you can't quite name. The closer the golden shadow gets to your actual life, the more uncomfortable the recognition becomes, because proximity makes the possibility of reclaiming it considerably harder to avoid. None of this is your fault in the sense of blame, and it's worth being precise about that distinction, because shadow work can easily curdle into another form of self-punishment if it isn't handled carefully. You did not choose, as a child, which feelings were safe to keep in view and which had to be relocated. That choice was made largely by your environment, by whoever was in the room reacting to you before you had any real say in the matter. But the responsibility for the retrieval now, as an adult with the capacity to examine this honestly, belongs to no one else. This isn't a burden imposed on you unfairly. It's simply the only door available. because nobody else has access to what's on the other side of it. There's a particular trap worth naming directly here, because well-meaning people fall into it constantly once they first learn about the shadow. It is tempting, once you understand this mechanism, to start using it as a new form of self-criticism, treating every reaction as evidence of some hidden flaw requiring urgent excavation, turning ordinary moments into a constant, exhausting audit of your own unconscious. This defeats the entire purpose. The goal of shadow work was never to generate more shame about yourself. It was to reduce the amount of energy spent unconsciously defending against material that, once actually examined, is usually far less dangerous than the defending against it has been. Approached with curiosity rather than alarm, this work tends to produce relief over time. Approached as another performance standard to fail at, it simply builds a more sophisticated version of the same old persona, one that now performs self-awareness instead of performing whatever it performed before. The retrieval itself tends to happen in an unglamorous, incremental way, nothing like the dramatic breakthroughs depicted in most stories about self-discovery. It looks like noticing, in the moment, that your irritation with a co-worker carries more heat than the situation explains, and staying with that extra heat for a few seconds instead of immediately acting on it, asking honestly what it might be pointing to, rather than simply discharging it outward. It looks like noticing the specific kind of compliment you deflect fastest, and asking, honestly, what about believing it would feel dangerous? It looks like noticing which people you find yourself unable to stop thinking about, whether through admiration or contempt, and treating that fixation as information rather than simply as a fact about them. There is also a relational dimension to this work that deserves its own attention, because the shadow rarely operates in isolation. Families, in particular, are extraordinarily efficient at distributing shadow material across their members, so that one person ends up carrying the visible anger for an entire household. While everyone else gets to remain calm and reasonable by comparison, their own unexpressed anger quietly offloaded onto the one person willing, or forced, to carry it. That person often gets labeled the difficult one, the dramatic one, the problem, when what has actually happened is considerably more collective than that label suggests. An entire family's disowned material finding a single convenient outlet, rather than being distributed honestly among everyone who actually contributed to it. Recognizing this pattern, if it applies to you, does not excuse behavior that genuinely needs to change. But it does complicate the simple story of you as the sole source of a family's difficulty, and it explains why leaving that system, even temporarily, so often produces a confusing sense of relief mixed with guilt. Relief because the borrowed weight lightens considerably outside the system that assigned it to you, and guilt because the system itself will very often, consciously or not, try to recruit you back into carrying it, framing your absence as abandonment rather than as the boundary it actually represents. What changes, with enough of this practice, is not the presence of a shadow. Everyone has one, permanently, by virtue of simply being a limited human being who cannot consciously hold everything at once. What changes is your relationship to its presence, the speed with which you notice it operating, the willingness to look instead of immediately explaining the feeling away or projecting it outward onto whoever happens to be nearby. That noticing, small and unglamorous as it is, repeated patiently across thousands of ordinary moments, is the entire mechanism by which a person gradually stops being run by what they've refused to see and starts, slowly, becoming someone capable of seeing the whole picture instead. Somewhere right now, someone is snapping at a person they love over something genuinely minor, with no idea that the size of the reaction has almost nothing to do with the moment in front of them, and everything to do with a door they sealed decades ago and have never once gone back to open. They may spend years blaming the people closest to them for provoking a reaction that was actually always coming from somewhere else entirely. Or they might, eventually, notice the disproportion and ask, for the first time, what exactly it is they've been protecting themselves from seeing.